The fastest way to find out who someone really is to watch how they treat people when they think nobody important is looking. Emily Carter would remember those words for the rest of her life. But at 9:37 on a rainy Tuesday morning, she had no idea that everything she had worked for was about to collapse. She sat alone in a cold conference room on the 12th floor of Hayes and Grant Logistics, staring at a printed document lying on the polished table in front of her. Her hands felt numb. Her stomach twisted into knots. Across the room, 3 managers avoided eye contact while pretending to review files. Nobody wanted to be there. Nobody wanted to look at her. And that was exactly what terrified her. Emily had worked at the company for almost 4 years. She had skipped vacations, stayed late countless nights, answered emails on weekends, and covered for coworkers whenever emergencies came up. Yet none of that seemed to matter now. Through the glass wall of the conference room, she could see employees moving through the hallway. Some glanced inside before quickly looking away. Rumors traveled fast in offices, and by now most people probably believed she was about to lose her job. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her younger sister, Megan. "How did the meeting go?" Emily stared at the message but couldn't bring herself to answer. The meeting hadn't even started, and somehow she already felt defeated. She checked the time again. 9:38. Every second felt longer than the last. Then the conference room door opened. Richard Hayes walked in without smiling. As usual, his expensive suit looked flawless. He carried a folder under one arm and wore the expression of someone who enjoyed making other people nervous. Richard wasn't just Emily's boss. He was the kind of manager employees warned new hires about in whispers. Demanding, unpredictable, always looking for someone else to blame when things went wrong. He took the seat across from her and placed the folder on the table. "Emily," he said flatly, folding his hands together. "This won't take long." Her chest tightened. She knew those words. Nobody ever heard them before receiving good news. Richard glanced toward the other managers, then back at her. "The board has concerns regarding recent project performance." Emily blinked. Project performance? She had exceeded every target assigned to her that quarter. She opened her mouth to respond, but Richard continued speaking before she could get a word in. "You'll have an opportunity to explain yourself," he said. "But first, there are some things you need to see." He slid the folder toward her. Emily stared at it without touching it. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. And as the room fell silent around her, she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst day of her life had started long before she walked into this building. In fact, it had started exactly 24 hours earlier, with a cup of coffee and a stranger she would never forget. 24 hours earlier, Emily Carter woke up before sunrise to the sound of rain tapping against her apartment window. The small one-bedroom unit she rented on the edge of the city was quiet except for the hum of an aging refrigerator and the occasional creak from the hallway outside. She reached for her phone and immediately felt a familiar wave of stress. 3 unread reminders sat at the top of her screen. Rent due in 6 days. Student loan payment due next week. Credit card balance overdue. Emily closed her eyes for a moment and took a slow breath. She had been working harder than ever, yet somehow every month felt tighter than the last. After getting dressed, she opened her banking app while waiting for coffee to brew. The number on the screen made her stomach sink. After paying utilities and helping her younger sister with part of a medical bill the previous week, she had less than $40 available until her next paycheck. $40. For groceries, gas, and anything unexpected. She forced herself not to panic. At 7:15, she grabbed her umbrella and headed toward her car. The rain had turned the morning commute into a slow-moving line of red brake lights stretching for miles. By the time she reached downtown, traffic was crawling. Then, just as she entered an intersection near her office, construction crews redirected vehicles into a single lane. Emily glanced at the dashboard clock. She was going to be late. Again, her shoulders tightened. Richard Hayes had made it very clear that he considered lateness a personal insult. When she finally parked and hurried toward the office district, the rain had become even heavier. Her shoes were damp, and her hair was beginning to lose its shape despite her efforts to stay dry. Across the street, she noticed a small coffee shop she sometimes visited when she needed a quick breakfast. She checked the time. 7:48. If she skipped breakfast, she could still make it upstairs before Richard started his morning rounds. But as she reached into her purse, her stomach growled loudly enough to make her laugh despite everything. She had not eaten dinner the night before, choosing instead to save money. Maybe a small coffee would help. Maybe 5 minutes would not matter. Inside, the warm smell of fresh coffee and baked pastries offered a brief escape from the pressure waiting outside. Business professionals stood in line checking emails while baristas moved quickly behind the counter. Emily stepped into line and counted the bills in her wallet. She could afford one small coffee, nothing more. As she waited, she noticed a man a few places ahead suddenly patting his pockets with a puzzled expression. He checked his jacket, then searched again. Something about the look on his face suggested he had just realized a problem, and for reasons she could not explain, Emily found herself paying attention. She had no idea that the next few minutes would quietly set in motion everything that was about to change. The man stepped up to the register and offered an apologetic smile to the cashier. He looked to be in his late 30s, neatly dressed, but not flashy, the kind of person who could easily blend into a crowd. "I am sorry," he said after checking his pockets one more time. "It looks like I left my wallet somewhere." The cashier nodded politely, but seemed unsure what to do. Several customers behind him shifted impatiently. One checked his watch. Another sighed loudly. The man glanced at the coffee and breakfast sandwich already waiting on the counter. "Do not worry about it," he said. "I will come back later." He started to step aside, but before he could move away, Emily heard herself speak. "I can cover it." The words surprised even her. The man turned around. "You do not have to do that." Emily almost agreed with him. After all, she barely had enough money to get through the week. But something about the situation felt familiar. Everyone needed help sometimes. "It is fine," she said. "Really?" She handed over a few bills and paid for both orders. The cashier thanked her and completed the transaction. For a second, Emily wondered if she had just made a very irresponsible financial decision. Then the man smiled. It was not the forced smile people used in business meetings. It looked genuine. "Thank you," he said. "Most people would have kept walking." Emily shrugged. "Most people probably have more money than I do." The man laughed softly. "That makes your kindness even more valuable." He picked up his coffee, but did not immediately leave. "Can I at least know your name?" he asked. "Emily." "Well, Emily, I appreciate this more than you know." She expected the conversation to end there, but instead he looked at her for a moment as though trying to remember something important. "Can I give you a piece of advice?" he asked. Emily glanced at the clock on the wall. She was already running late. "Sure." The man nodded toward the large office towers visible through the front window. Sometimes the people making the biggest difference are the ones nobody notices. Emily smiled politely, unsure what that was supposed to mean. "I will keep that in mind." He extended his hand. "Daniel." She shook it. His grip was firm but relaxed. Then another customer stepped forward, and the moment was over. Daniel thanked her once more before heading toward the door. As he stepped outside into the rain, he paused and looked back. "I hope today turns out better than you expect," he said. Then he disappeared into the crowded sidewalk. Emily stood there for a second, puzzled by the comment. Better than you expect? If anything, she expected the day to get worse. She grabbed her coffee and hurried toward the exit. Outside, the rain continued, falling over downtown streets packed with commuters. Within minutes, she was rushing through the lobby of Hayes and Grant Logistics, hoping she could still make it to her desk unnoticed. Unfortunately, Richard Hayes was already waiting. Emily barely made it through the lobby before she heard her name. "Ms. Carter." Her heart sank instantly. Richard Hayes stood near the elevators holding a tablet in one hand. Several employees were nearby, pretending not to listen. Emily forced a polite smile. "Good morning." Richard glanced at his watch. "Is there a reason you decided to arrive late today?" Emily looked at the clock above the reception desk. She was 3 minutes behind schedule. 3 minutes. Traffic was backed up because of construction, she explained. "And the weather." Richard raised a hand, cutting her off. "Interesting. Because the rest of the city somehow managed to get here on time." A few uncomfortable faces turned away. Emily felt heat rise in her cheeks. Public criticism had become one of Richard's favorite management techniques. "It will not happen again," she said quietly. "I certainly hope not." Without another word, he stepped into the elevator. The doors closed, leaving an awkward silence behind. Emily took a slow breath and followed on the next elevator. The day only became worse from there. By mid-morning, she was juggling 3 separate projects after a coworker called in sick. Normally, she could handle the workload, But Richard kept adding new tasks while demanding updates every 30 minutes. At 11 o'clock, he called an unexpected department meeting. Employees gathered around the conference table while Richard reviewed quarterly numbers displayed on a large screen. Everything seemed routine until he stopped on one particular slide. "Here we have a problem," he announced. The room became quiet. Richard pointed toward a delayed client proposal. "This account should have been completed last week." Emily stared at the screen in confusion. She had submitted her portion days ago. The delay had occurred because another department failed to provide required data. Richard knew that. Everyone in management knew that. Yet he turned toward her. "Emily, would you care to explain why this happened?" For a moment, she thought she had misunderstood. "The analytics package was delivered late from operations," she said carefully. "I sent several follow-up requests." Richard shook his head. Excuses do not solve problems. Several co-workers exchanged glances. Nobody spoke. Nobody wanted to become the next target. Emily felt frustration building inside her. "I am not making excuses," she replied. "I am explaining what happened." Richard smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "And I am explaining why clients do not pay us for explanations." The meeting continued, but the damage was done. By lunchtime, word had spread that Emily was responsible for the delay. People who normally chatted with her avoided eye contact. Others seemed uncertain what to believe. Back at her desk, she opened her inbox and discovered another surprise. Richard had copied senior management on an email questioning her performance. Emily read it twice, unable to believe what she was seeing. Every criticism ignored the facts. Every problem described in the message had involved decisions she never controlled. Yet there it was in writing. Her phone buzzed. It was a calendar notification she did not recognize. A meeting request had just appeared on her schedule for the following morning. No explanation. No agenda. Only a conference room number and a list of attendees that included several executives she had never met. Emily stared at the screen. Why would senior leadership want a meeting with her? And why did she suddenly feel like someone was quietly setting a trap? Emily spent the rest of the afternoon trying to focus on work, but the mysterious meeting invitation refused to leave her mind. Every time she opened a spreadsheet or answered an email, her eyes drifted back to the calendar notification. The attendee list made no sense. 2 senior executives from headquarters were scheduled to attend. The director of human resources was included as well. Even stranger, Richard Hayes had accepted the invitation almost immediately. By 5 o'clock, Emily had convinced herself of the most obvious explanation. They were preparing to let her go. It was the only scenario that seemed to fit. She packed her bag and headed toward the parking garage feeling exhausted. The rain had finally stopped, but dark clouds still covered the evening sky. During the drive home, her phone rang. It was her sister Megan. "You sound tired," Megan said after Emily answered. "Long day." Emily forced a laugh. "You could say that." She briefly explained the meeting scheduled for the next morning. Megan was silent for a moment. "Maybe it is not bad news. Executives do not schedule surprise meetings with employees to hand out compliments. You do not know that." Emily appreciated the attempt, but neither of them sounded convinced. After ending the call, she stopped at a grocery store and carefully counted prices while pushing a cart through the aisles. Every purchase felt like a calculation. Every dollar mattered. By the time she reached her apartment, the stress of the day had settled heavily across her shoulders. She heated a simple dinner, answered a few remaining work emails, and tried to distract herself with television. Nothing worked. At 8:47 that evening, a new email appeared in her inbox. The sender field contained only a generic corporate address. Emily opened it immediately. Her heart began beating faster as she read the message. There was no greeting and no signature. Just one sentence. "Please bring any documentation related to the Carson Logistics account to tomorrow's meeting." Emily frowned. The Carson account was the same project Richard had blamed her for during the department meeting. Why would senior leadership suddenly want those records? Curious, she opened the company database and reviewed months of correspondence. Within minutes, she noticed something odd. Several approval requests she had submitted were marked as delayed by management. The timestamps showed exactly when decisions had been postponed. Decisions that had not been hers to make. Decisions that had required Richard's authorization. Emily stared at the screen. She had never bothered comparing all the records side by side before. The pattern was impossible to ignore. For the first time all day, doubt replaced fear. What if the meeting was not actually about her mistakes? What if someone else had been reviewing the same information? Before she could think further, another notification appeared. This time it was a company-wide announcement. All department heads were required to attend a special leadership session the following morning. No explanation was provided. The message triggered immediate speculation across internal chat groups. Some employees guessed a merger was coming. Others suspected budget cuts. Nobody seemed to know the truth. Emily shut her laptop and stared out the window into the darkness. Somewhere inside the company, something important was happening. She could feel it. What she did not know was that by this time tomorrow, the balance of power inside Hayes and Grant Logistics would look completely different. Emily arrived at the office nearly 40 minutes early the next morning. She wanted time to organize the Carson Logistics documentation before the meeting. The building felt different from the moment she stepped into the lobby. Employees gathered in small groups, speaking in lowered voices. Rumors had spread overnight, and nobody seemed certain what was happening. Even managers appeared unusually tense. As Emily crossed the lobby, she noticed something else. Several unfamiliar individuals wearing visitor badges were speaking with members of senior leadership. They were dressed professionally, carrying tablets and folders, and moving through the building with quiet confidence. Whatever was happening clearly involved more than a routine meeting. When Emily reached her desk, she found an envelope waiting beside her keyboard. There was no name on the front. Curious, she opened it and discovered a single printed note. Conference room 12. 9:30 sharp. Bring all records. No signature. No explanation. Her pulse quickened. By 9:15, employees throughout the office seemed distracted. Workstations sat unattended. Conversations stopped whenever someone from management walked by. Even Richard Hayes appeared different. Throughout the morning, he had paced between meetings, checking his phone repeatedly. His usual confidence seemed strained. At 9:25, Emily gathered her files and headed toward conference room 12. The closer she got, the more nervous she became. The hallway outside the room was already crowded with executives and department leaders. Some she recognized from company newsletters. Others she had never seen before. Through the glass wall, she counted nearly 20 people seated around the large conference table. This was far bigger than anything she had expected. Emily quietly entered and found an empty chair near the end of the table. Richard sat several seats away. For the first time since she had known him, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. His smile appeared forced as he exchanged brief comments with another executive. At exactly 9:30, the room fell silent. The door opened. Everyone turned toward the entrance. 3 individuals walked in together. The first was the director of human resources. The second was a senior executive from corporate headquarters. The third person caused Emily's breath to catch. For a moment, she thought she must be mistaken. It was impossible. Yet there was no doubt. The same calm expression. The same steady eyes. The same voice she remembered from the coffee shop. Daniel. He looked around the room and acknowledged several executives with a nod. The reaction was immediate. Senior leaders stood to greet him. Department heads straightened in their chairs. Even Richard rose from his seat. Emily felt completely frozen. Her mind raced through every possibility, but none of them made sense. Daniel noticed her almost instantly. For the briefest moment, surprise crossed his face. Then a small smile appeared before he returned his attention to the room. He took a seat at the head of the table. Not beside the executives. Not behind them. At the head. Emily's confusion deepened. Who exactly was he? The senior executive cleared his throat. Thank you all for attending. We have several important matters to discuss this morning. Around the room, people exchanged uncertain glances. Emily barely heard the introduction. She could not stop staring at Daniel. The stranger she had met less than 24 hours earlier clearly held a position of extraordinary authority. But the biggest shock came seconds later when the executive addressed him directly. Mr. Brooks, he said respectfully, would you like to begin? Daniel Brooks stood and calmly surveyed the room before speaking. His voice was steady, confident, and impossible to ignore. Thank you for being here. The room remained silent. Every executive, manager, and department head seemed focused entirely on him. Emily sat motionless, still trying to understand how the man from the coffee shop had suddenly become the most important person in the building. Daniel folded his hands in front of him. As many of you know, the board recently initiated an internal operational review across several divisions. A large screen behind him came to life, displaying charts, reports, and performance data. The purpose of that review was simple. We wanted to identify obstacles preventing good employees from succeeding. Emily noticed several executives exchanging nervous glances. Daniel continued. What we found was not a lack of talent. It was not a lack of effort. In several cases, it was a failure of leadership. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. Richard Hayes straightened in his chair. For the first time, genuine concern appeared on his face. Daniel pressed a button on a remote control. Another slide appeared. This one displayed information related to the Carson Logistics account. Emily recognized the data instantly. Over the past 6 months, Daniel said, multiple project delays were attributed to employees who were not responsible for the delays. A murmur spread through the room. Daniel remained composed. The review team examined communication records, approval histories, internal messages, and management decisions. More documents appeared on the screen. Timestamps, approval requests, escalation notices. Emily's eyes widened. These were the same records she had reviewed the night before. Daniel looked toward the far side of the table. Mr. Hayes, can you explain why repeated authorization delays were assigned to members of your staff rather than reported accurately? Richard cleared his throat. There may be some misunderstanding regarding the context. Daniel nodded. Politely. Then please provide the context. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Project management requires difficult decisions. Sometimes accountability must be distributed across a team. Daniel remained silent for several seconds. The pause felt longer than any speech. Finally, he pressed another button. A series of emails appeared. Several were written by Emily. Others contained responses from management. The dates clearly showed approval requests waiting days or even weeks before receiving action. None of the delays originated with Emily. None. A senior executive leaned forward. These records were verified? Multiple times, Daniel replied, including by independent auditors. The room became even quieter. Richard's confidence visibly faded. Daniel continued presenting evidence. Other employees had experienced similar situations. Work had been completed properly. Credit had been redirected. Responsibility for delays had been reassigned. Performance evaluations had reflected information that was incomplete at best and misleading at worst. One by one, facts replaced assumptions. Then something unexpected happened. A department manager seated near the center of the table raised her hand. I would like to add something. Daniel nodded. Within minutes, another manager spoke. Then another. Several leaders described concerns they had quietly observed for months. Emily listened in disbelief. People who had remained silent suddenly seemed willing to tell the truth. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Daniel allowed the discussion to continue before finally addressing the room again. This review was never about finding someone to blame for poor results, he said. It was about understanding why capable employees were struggling despite producing strong work. Then he looked directly at Richard. And I believe we now have our answer. The silence that followed Daniel's statement seemed to stretch across the entire room. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Richard Hayes looked from one executive to another as if searching for support, but the expressions around the table told a different story. The evidence displayed on the screen had become impossible to dismiss. Every delayed approval, every inaccurate performance review, every misplaced assignment of responsibility had formed a pattern that no longer looked accidental. Daniel remained calm. Leadership is not measured by authority, he said. It is measured by responsibility. When employees succeed, a leader shares the credit. When employees struggle, a leader helps solve the problem. What we discovered during this review reflects the opposite approach. Richard leaned forward. With respect, I believe these conclusions are unfair. Daniel nodded. You have every right to express your perspective. Richard immediately seized the opportunity. For several minutes, he attempted to explain the decisions under review. He described competitive pressures, demanding clients, staffing shortages, and difficult business conditions. Under different circumstances, some of those explanations might have sounded reasonable. The problem was that every statement now existed alongside months of documented records. The facts remained unchanged. When Richard finished speaking, Daniel turned toward the executives seated beside him. One by one, they confirmed the findings of the review. Human Resources verified employee complaints that had previously gone unresolved. Internal auditors confirmed documentation inconsistencies. Senior leadership acknowledged concerns regarding team performance data. Each confirmation seemed to remove another layer of confidence from Richard's expression. Emily watched quietly, hardly believing what she was witnessing. For years, employees had accepted the situation because they assumed nothing would ever change. Now the entire structure appeared to be shifting in front of them. Daniel finally stood. "Mr. Hayes, thank you for your comments." The room became still again. After reviewing all available information, the board has reached a decision. Richard's jaw tightened. Nobody looked away. "Effective immediately," Daniel continued. "Your leadership responsibilities are being reassigned pending final administrative review." A wave of surprise moved through the room despite the evidence everyone had already seen. Daniel's tone never changed. It remained professional and measured. "The company requires leaders who create accountability through honesty and trust. We cannot achieve long-term success without those principles." Richard slowly lowered his eyes. For the first time since Emily had known him, he had no response. Human resources representatives calmly explained the next administrative steps. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontation, just a clear decision supported by documented facts. Yet the impact felt enormous. Around the table, employees exchanged stunned glances. Some appeared relieved. Others simply looked exhausted, as though a burden they had carried for years had finally been lifted. Daniel waited until the discussion concluded before addressing the group once more. "This process was never about punishment," he said. "It was about restoring fairness." Then he looked around the room. Many talented people inside this company have spent too much time defending themselves instead of doing their best work. That ends today. Emily felt a lump form in her throat. Those words struck closer to home than Daniel could possibly know. Or perhaps he knew exactly how much they mattered. As executives began gathering their materials, Emily assumed the meeting was finally over. She expected everyone to leave and return to their normal routines. Instead, Daniel glanced toward the far end of the table where she sat. "Before we conclude," he said, "there is one more matter we need to discuss." And suddenly, every eye in the room turned toward Emily Carter. Emily felt every pair of eyes in the room settle on her. For a brief moment, the old fear returned. After everything that had happened, part of her still expected bad news. Daniel noticed the uncertainty on her face and offered a reassuring smile. "Ms. Carter," he said, "would you mind joining us at the front of the room?" Emily stood slowly and carried her folder to the conference table. The room remained silent as she took a seat closer to Daniel and the executive team. She had spent years trying not to attract attention in meetings. Now she was suddenly the center of one. Daniel opened a file and looked around the room. Over the past several weeks, our review team evaluated employee performance across multiple departments. We examined project outcomes, peer feedback, client satisfaction reports, and leadership recommendations. He paused briefly. One name appeared consistently. Emily felt her pulse quicken. Daniel continued. Despite receiving limited support, despite being assigned responsibility for issues outside her control, and despite working under circumstances that would have discouraged many people, Emily Carter continued delivering exceptional work. Several executives nodded. One of them opened a report and referenced specific projects Emily had completed successfully. Another highlighted positive client feedback. A third pointed to process improvements she had introduced months earlier that were still saving the company time and money. Emily listened in disbelief. Many of these accomplishments had never been acknowledged before. Some she assumed nobody had even noticed. Daniel closed the report and turned toward her. "Talent is valuable," he said. "Character is even more valuable." The room remained completely still. A company can teach technical skills. It can teach systems and procedures. It cannot easily teach integrity. Emily felt emotion building in her chest. Daniel smiled. "Which brings me to something I learned yesterday morning." For the first time, a few people around the table looked confused. Daniel glanced at Emily. "I believe we met at a coffee shop downtown." A ripple of surprise spread across the room. Emily laughed softly, partly from embarrassment and partly from relief. "Yes, we did." Daniel nodded. "I forgot my wallet." "She paid for my breakfast." Several executives smiled. One even laughed quietly. Daniel raised a hand. The amount itself was not important. What mattered was that she helped someone when she believed there was nothing to gain from doing so. He looked around the room. "She did not know who I was. She did not expect recognition. She simply chose kindness. The room fell silent again. Daniel's next words seemed directed not only at the executives, but at everyone present. The strongest organizations are built by people who do the right thing when nobody is watching. He then turned back toward Emily. On behalf of the board, I would like to thank you. A senior executive slid a document across the table. Emily stared at it in shock. It was an offer for a newly created leadership position within the operations division, a role that included a significant salary increase, expanded responsibilities, and direct access to executive mentorship programs. For a moment, she could not speak. Everything she had feared losing less than 24 hours earlier had transformed into an opportunity she never imagined possible. As the meeting concluded, employees approached to congratulate her. Yet the moment she remembered most happened a few minutes later as people began leaving the room. Daniel stopped beside her and smiled. I told you yesterday that I hoped your day would turn out better than you expected. Emily laughed. You definitely left out a few details. Daniel smiled. Sometimes the people making the biggest difference are the ones nobody notices. This time, she finally understood exactly what he meant.